If you've been feeling like the world is an unstable place, you're not crazy. If you've been feeling like it's a more competitive place, more antagonistic place, a less idealistic place, you're not crazy. Like, yeah, no, that's all going on. And if it, we are in a time of enormous transition in the world. Enormous transition. We're not going back to 1965 America and then what that meant for the world. We're not. We're not. It's impossible. No clock ever resets. You just God never does that. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Wild at Heart podcast. My son Blaine with me here this week because we have someone else that we really want to introduce you to. Someone's podcast that we really want to introduce you to. And Mark Sayers, who's a pastor down in Melbourne, Australia, author, speaker, teacher guy, has a podcast that you awakened me to about a year ago.
Yeah, sometime last year. Yeah. It's called Rebuilders.
Yeah, Rebuilders podcast. We're going to put all this in the notes because once you hear this guy, you're going to know, oh, this is why. And we're going to bring him on after the pause that we take. But I like Mark Sayers. Why?
Well, John Tyson, who was on the show not long ago, described Mark Sayers as a unicorn.
Right.
He is a one of a kind because he's not only able to do high level cultural and political analysis, he's also filled with the Holy Spirit, discipling people, and able to bring those things all the way down to the ground level where you actually preach the kingdom and give people contact hours as disciples and resolve issues of community life. So you'll see when it comes to describing in approachable terms the forces that are shaping the world, Mark Sayers can do that.
Yes.
However, what makes him stand out is that he is passionate about seeing a renewal of Christianity by the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, globally.
Yeah. And he's very pastoral and prophetic and able to give people guidelines when it comes to doing that.
Yeah. This is a super smart guy. And the reason we're bringing him in is it's so hard to find someone who can do high-level cultural analysis from a Christian worldview without kind of bringing in their sort of political agenda with it a little bit on the side, or maybe a lot, big servings of it. And he seems to be able to do that because he's just such a kingdom-hearted guy. His fundamental commitment is Jesus Christ. But his intellect and his knowledge of history and politics and cultural trends, you're gonna hear this in just a minute, has been so helpful to us because, we've been talking about, the chaos in the world and the movements and big cultural trends. But here's a guy that's gonna help bring some more clarity to that. So we're gonna take our pause and then we're gonna introduce Mark, and this will probably run through 2 podcasts. We're just gonna have a big, long conversation with him, and given the content and not wanting to go too fast through things, we'll probably end up slicing this up into 2 podcasts. But before we introduce Mark and bring him in by technology from Australia, let's take our pause. Father, Jesus, Holy Spirit, I give everything to you. Every person, all the global news, I give to you my work and the future. I give you the future, my future, God, just this week. I give you all things. And just take a moment, friends. What do you need to release in order to be present to God? Most of us could actually probably keep going And if you need to, just hit pause and keep going and then come back. But Jesus, we're releasing all this to you in order to get out of the pace of modern life, in order to get our soul back. And we ask you to restore our union and to meet us here in this very unique podcast. In your name we pray. Amen. Okay, the pause is always good. And you're going to appreciate it for where we're about to go, because this is going to, because we pre-recorded this, I know what's about to happen. This is going to stretch your brain a little bit, which is a good thing. We all need to be exercised. We need that as well.
Exercised and exercised.
Yeah, there you go. What I want to say to you as we introduce Mark is hang in there. He sounds a lot like Blaine, and there's a kinship there, but the content is so worth it. These ideas are this is just going to put everything you've been feeling for the last 10 years, it's going to explain it to you. Okay, why has everything been feeling so tense, so unstable, so changing? What's going on? You're about to find out why. Hang in there, because as we get through that, we're going to get to some really cool things that God is doing in the world. And so with that, I'm going to welcome Mark to the show. Mark Sayers, welcome to our podcast. We're very glad to have you here.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure and honor, to be chatting.
Yeah, we have benefited from your work so much in so many ways, and I was delighted to hear offline that we've been a bit of a blessing to your church as well. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, it's amazing.
So people know the facts about you. Married, pastoring in Melbourne, and author, all that. But you were sharing recently on one of your more recent podcasts, just the heart that God has given you for renewal. And I'd love for you to just share a little bit of your heart before we get into large global trends, significant movements shaping the chaos in the world right now. Like, tell us about your heart.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been passionate about the church and seeing God impact the world, and there's also a deep personal relationship with Jesus that maintains that, and recognition of how much He's changed me. And but in 2017, I was preaching once at our church in our afternoon or 5 p.m. service, which is a lot of young adults, and just as I was preaching, you're often thinking about what you're saying, but weirdly, sort of God was speaking to me, and I didn't realize, but at the time I'd become quite pessimistic. And Melbourne, and particularly my state of Victoria in Australia, is probably feels like one of the more secular places. It's more difficult to be a Christian, and the story of the church in Australia is very different to the US. The first church built in Australia was burnt down. Only lasted a few years. And so it's often been described, faith in Australia, as something on the margins a little bit, or that Aussies don't like religion, which is not entirely true, but that's the narrative. And not only that, it just felt this real sense of how much the culture was seducing, shaping people. And I just got to this point of halfway through my sermon, I'm preaching, and then there's almost this like, what am I doing? Like, is this even making an impact? And I felt the Lord sort of really convict me in that moment, and He just planted a seed for renewal, of this idea that what if it's not about the cultural script? What if it's actually about the fact that Jesus is someone who is resurrected from the dead, and He brings dead things to life and does unexpected plot twists of redemption? And what if, what I realized is I believe that about the past. I love the stories of the past when God had done that. But could I believe that He could do that in a time like ours and in a place like where I lived? And it's also this thing that, so for example, being an Aussie who's traveled to the US many times, come a couple times a year, done that for a long time. You'd come to things in the US which are like big events, and there's all this energy and stuff happening, and then you'd come back here, and sometimes it sort of felt quite discouraging. So could I believe that God could do something here? And it just began this journey since 2017 of just almost counterculturally believing that God could move. So I'm not naturally a renewal, awakening, revival guy. And even probably before that, I sometimes looked at that perhaps a little bit cynically or cerebrally. And he just was like, dare to believe, which felt so counterculture in a very intellectual, cynical city like mine. And so it's just been amazing to see, God begin to work and, see springtime budding of, I think, some things that are happening now. So that's really my passion. I talk a lot about culture, particularly outside of my church, but behind that is a driving heart for God to renew. I want to understand culture so I can see how Christ can transform it.
Yes, we do too. And in our own way, we've been talking about, shifting tectonic plates and chaos and the intensity. And I think that most people feel it almost in their bodies. They can feel the instability, the changes taking place, but they haven't had context for it. And you've just been doing such a gift through Rebuilders podcast and through your writing to give it context. This is why you're feeling some of these things. This is why it does feel unstable. Some of the big things, and also hopeful. We're going to get to the hopeful as well. So what we're going to do now is pull out to 30,000 feet, and we're going to take advantage of our time with Mark here to riff on some big themes, right? And so if you've been in his material very deeply in the last couple of years, and then turned me onto it, where would we start? Like, what would be
I would start with A Non-Anxious Presence, which is a book that you wrote, and a frame that you offer in that book within which you can understand the kind of moment that we're living in, which you hold out this thing called a gray zone.
Yeah.
So first question would be, Mark, what is a gray zone? And what does that mean in terms of the situation that we find ourselves in?
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting, and that felt language is really important, because there's an element where you could go and read a bunch of academic books, go to some lectures, and hear some of what's going on, but you feel it in a particular way, living your life at this moment. I think the average person sees so many changes happening, but it's multi-field. There's multiple fields this change is happening in. And you feel it in the tension in certain conversations. You turn on the news or, look at the news on your phone, and it's just a maelstrom of chaotic stories and plot twists. And it's just this overwhelming sense I think the average person has. And I began to think about, what is that experience and what is going on? And often I realize that, history is divided into eras. You could talk about the Renaissance, the medieval era. We've in the English-speaking world, perhaps more so in my country than yours, but we talked about periods of history in the past with kings and queens, the Elizabethan era, the Edwardian era. And really what that was, that there was some kind of mood, dominant thoughts, and there might be, competing dominant thoughts in that era, but there was a kind of economic, political, social, religious order that tended to give a certain era its shape. So people might talk about Victorian sensibilities, that the people in the Victorian era thought a particular way. They had certain kinds of families and so on.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking...
And those... Well, and those cultural consensus provides a lot of stability, right? Yeah, there's a cultural literacy. There's an agreement on this is who we are. This is how we do things. And it provides a kind of settledness in those eras.
Yes. And one way to add to that, to the analogy, is that there's a lot of signposts, this is the way to this place and that's the way to that place. So yeah, they're markers that communicate how you should act, how you should think, how you should feel. So I was almost trying to think for some time, like, what is this new era we're in, you know? And like 30 years ago, people were talking about a postmodern era, but it didn't seem satisfying. There definitely was postmodern art and architecture, but like nothing seemed to be sticking. So for a little while, I was, you know, just having this thought experiment. What's this new era? And then I came to the realization, looking at history and reading a lot of history, that we're actually not in a new era. We're definitely at the end of an era. Everyone feels that. You know, you know, near me there was a DVD store. It's not there anymore. You know, it's now a Asian grocer. But that was an era which, for a lot of people's lives, that there was always going to be DVD stores, but it's not there. But then there's this sense where the next thing is not fully here yet either. So we definitely feel that an era is over or ending, a new era is coming. But where we find ourselves is between the two. And so, you know, this idea of gray zone I took from really the field of military studies, where I read a number of articles about gray zone warfare. So, you know, there was this clear line when war was declared. So in World War II, when the United States was attacked by, you know, the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, there was this clear, declaration of war. And so it's quite funny when you think about it that, you know, ambassadors would go to the other country, hand them a letter and say, we are at war with you. And it was actually done very sort of gentlemanly like. They'd, you know, sort of shake hands and then go their separate ways and then start trying to kill each other, which is quite strange. But we live in this time now where war is not clearly defined. There's cyber operations, hackers are used, organized crime is used, infrastructure is attacked. In Iran in the last couple of days, things have been blowing up, you know, and, you know, it's very possible that that's a cyber operation or sabotage operation. Is it a full-blown declaration of war? We don't know. So you get into this like information war, political war, economic war, and it's not clear. Are we at war? Are we not? So I took that term to actually put this time between eras as a gray zone. It's not black and white. You can see elements of the old era still here. So there's a bunch of people fooled that we're still living in the old era. You can see something coming, and there's a bunch of people trying to like hedge and be in the new era, but it's not clear what new era we're going to have. And sometimes you think it's going this direction, and then it goes in that direction. So, you know, for me, this captured the sense of what we're living through. And as I've communicated, it's been one of those things like everyone's like, aha, yes, that's exactly what it feels like. So we know we're heading towards something, but we're not there yet.
I really appreciate even the recent Iran example, the ambiguity of war in the world right now. It is a really great description of the ambiguity of everything else. Like
yes.
in the gray zone, what's happening? And yeah.
It is, especially if, you know, one way to define an age. I know that in a recent show you mentioned Peter Turchin's work, and part of his thesis is that an age is defined by a stable distribution of power. And in that, your sort of road sign image is actually so relevant, where if you want to succeed in a certain industry, well, there's a pathway there. If you want to understand where the alliances are between nations, you can very quickly wrap your mind around that. If you want to know the kind of ideas that are going to gain traction, you can follow that. But right now, because the future is not yet determined, you can't do any of those things. And one thing that you mentioned in An Unanxious Presence, which is interesting, is that between eras, the old era doesn't just fade, it actually intensifies.
Yes.
And then elements of the new regime begin sort of creeping in, but there's no larger framework within which you can sort of arrange or interpret them.
Yeah. Yeah. So for example, take us back to post-World War II, like the defining, you know, elements of what we would call the order that we're leaving, the existing order that we are moving out of.
Yeah. So yeah, to name the order that we've moved out, it would be, you could call it the post-war order. And so, you know, you think about the 1930s, or, you know, we have the Great Depression. the world goes into a grey zone really in the 1930s, and there's all political, different new ideologies, Bolshevism, communism, fascism, all fighting. And then it turns into a war, and it's a devastating war. But at the end of that war, very much America emerges as ascendant. Japan as a power is not there. China as a power is not there. Europe was a power. Great Britain was the global superpower, but it's very much weakened by the war. And this enables, in the United States, interestingly, a little bit in Australia too, you see this emergence of this manufacturing boom, and so a bunch of stuff come together. There's an economic story, there's a technological story, there's a geopolitical story, there's a political story. And, even our country, which was, we're part of the Commonwealth, and the King Charles is technically the head of state of Australia. You see Australia move in its alliance. It's still allied to Britain, but more to the United States. And so the United States builds up a new form of power in the world, which is more an influence which is around trade, and it's around sort of global projection of power, but it's less like we're going to move and take over all these countries. I mean, there's a little bit of that in a few places, but really it's the beginnings of globalization with the United States at the pinnacle, but it's also part of the Cold War. So there's a competition going on with the forces of communism. Behind the Iron Curtain, there's the Eastern Bloc and so on. So it's this great competition, and almost this competition, it's like two, they say that one, pine tree by itself doesn't grow as fast as one surrounded by other pine trees. And so there's this space race, there's a nuclear weapons race. Even out of those missiles in the nuclear space race, a lot of our technology that we're using in these computers now may not have been here if you didn't have that competition. So Silicon Valley also gets a bit of a start, not just from sort of hippies with computers in garages. A lot of the origins can go back to this sort of military industrial spending. So, this period, the ascendancy, you could sort of say, so you get to the mid 1960s, and the US is dominant industrial-wise, it's dominant culturally, Hollywood, music, it's dominant in the global order, but it's still in competition with the Soviet Union primarily. But then something happens in around 1989 to 1990, which even the CIA were completely bamboozled by, which is that communism falls. And so the Berlin Wall falls, and this great Cold War competition between these two power ends. And then, so I'd say this is the intensification of the height of the post-war era. So it begins in 1990. All of a sudden, there is no competition. Francis Fukuyama writes a famous essay called The End of History. He's like, this is it. The great struggle of history is over. Here we are.
Right.
The future is going to be this comfortable, liberal democracy, and everyone's going to have as much consumer goodies as they want. It's also the birth of the internet, really, around this time, where the internet's going to connect us. We're going to have online friends, and it's going to boost democracy. And, you won't be able to lie because people will see online that you're lying, so very utopian. And, even had Greenspan, who's the head of the Fed, saying stuff like, we're not going to have recessions. We're just going to head into endless growth. So, this really sort of defines the world, this period of, unipolar America as the dominant power in the world, globalization, technology, consumerism going out. But at the heart of it, too, was an intensification of individualism. So almost the individual could be this floating person who could, work in New York and then move to Tokyo. And people in a certain class around the world had more in common with each other. And so this is where we thought history was going, a sort of really smooth utopian slide to a sort of kind of progressive future. But I think a number of shocks begin. So September 11th is a shock. The global financial crisis in 2008 is a shock. And this creates a lot of disenfranchisement around the world. And the seeds, I mean, again, this could be a 7-hour lecture, but the seeds of what we're experiencing now, I think can go back to 2008. So there's a group of people in many countries, but you look at places like the Rust Belt of the US who start to go, hang on, we're not part of this story. There's a bunch of people who go, this story is great and our lives are getting better, but there's a bunch of people saying our lives have gotten worse. We want to go back to 1965 where there was that moment of, everyone could get a job in the factory in the local town and so on. And then 2016, it really comes on to the radar, Brexit, a political result that no one in that sort of like elite class, expected. Election of Donald Trump, but then just a cascade across the world of election results of people who were outside of that era's thinking. And then it becomes to be clear that, hang on, this is not a blip. This era is starting to end. And then that's where we are now. So that's my quick history since the end of World War II.
Yeah, that was a big ask to try and do that succinctly. But let's take a few of the categories that will help people understand, we're moving from this to this. We're moving from this to this. For example, you were using even the Obama era, idealism really marked the post-war ascendancy. The whole world's going to be democratic at some point. We're just going to be able to export democracy into all these countries, and everybody's going to get online, and we're going to have free, open trade, free trade. Idealism to what? Let's walk through a few of those categories.
Yeah. Well, what you're seeing is a shift from idealism to pragmatism, And in philosophy, there's been a great struggle between the idealists and the materialists. Basically the idealists believe the world is shaped by ideas, and then the materialists believe that the world is shaped by the material reality of the world. And so we're seeing a shift back to the material reality of the world. So it's not dealing with the world as we want it to be, it's dealing with the world as it is. So I think what a lot of people didn't realize is that you can talk about a lot of these idealistic things and have, political discourse about, whether that Japanese anime's political categories are right, versus someone who's like, hang on, my next paycheck might bounce. That changes how people look at the world. So what we're seeing in the world is much more a shift where, global conferences of people who talk about big foreign policy issues are less talking about now how can we eradicate waterborne illnesses, or how can we advance rights in this developing country, to how do we deal with disinformation and global conflict. You're seeing this significant shift, and I think a lot of the church got bamboozled a little bit by this, because we naturally talk about ideas, we like theology. And, there's a big thing, which is, I don't think this is necessarily wrong, talk about worldview and stuff like this, and people are thinking this, and here's this particular ideology. All that matters, but we missed the material realities that were changing on the ground. So Ronald Engelhardt, who's a religious sociologist, talks about there's almost this scale that the more safe and secure and comfortable you are, the more sort of obscure the things you can talk about and disconnected from real life is. Your politics gets a bit more disconnected from real life. But then when you don't feel secure, you feel in danger, you don't feel comfortable, you can't provide for your needs or your family's needs, all of a sudden politics is much more about, I don't care about your great project, just get someone in who can make the economy work for me so that I can have a job.
Fix the economy. Yep.
Yes. So that changes. So that's one thing that we're living through in this grey zone, is this massive shift from sort of idealistic utopian ideas down to a much more dealing with the world. And again, too, you can see that the two parties are not, as I don't mean the political parties, but the ideas people and idealistic people are still there, very strong, but the material people are emerging and strong. And there's a lot of people caught between the two.
There's a point that could be a footnote on that, which has to do with the primary social group within which people identify. And in an idealistic environment, people tend to identify primarily in terms of identity.
Yes.
But that isn't true when people start to get pragmatic. I just kicked you. What do people shift to when they can't find security within an identity group?
Yes. So it's really interesting, in the last sort of 10 years, a lot of talk about diversity. But if you actually look at the sort of anthropologist academic world, people 10 years ago went from diversity to talk about hyperdiversity. So for example, one example I heard was, you could say North Africans just say Dutch politicians would talk about the North African, the Dutch people of North African extraction. That's diversity language. But then, anthropologists are saying, well, if you look at North Africans in the Netherlands, there's a whole grouping. There could be, Moroccans or Algerians, and if you just look at Moroccans, there's men and women, and then multiple different types of religious groups and economic groups and so on. So you go into absolute complexity. So what happens with identity politics? It doesn't go from identity politics back to the mass. It hyper fragments, and you start to see the battles within. You think of Europe when it was just all these little kingdoms and statelets. That's what we're heading towards. So you're 100% right. The idealistic idea was that through identity politics, we could sort of create a measure of achievable sort of forms of justice or utopia, but then hyper fragmentation really undermines that.
Tribalism.
Yeah, and even like tribal, you can have very big tribe. You can almost go from nation to tribalism. It's almost, then a lot of history was actually sort of feuds between kins. So it's even like smaller groupings.
Right. A cost of living crisis began to hit the world, which caused this pragmatism. Like I'm dropping out of idealism now because like gas is more expensive and groceries are more expensive. Like use that as an example of how that just drives this collapse of idealism.
Yeah. So we have the global, financial crisis in 2008. And one of the things that governments do to respond to that is stimulus. So there is a complex way that they do that, but effectively it's printing money. And the US has been able to do that because it has the global reserve currency, but it happened all over the world. So my country did stimulus. There were these like every school or community center got this like sports like room, sort of place, and that actually keep the Australian economy going. Because if you put money into the economy, it can help it, and that can work sometimes in economics. COVID hits, and a lot of people don't remember this because they think about the different things around COVID, around, I don't know, social distancing or masking or lockdowns. But there was another story in COVID, is that when COVID hit, the world had an economic shock that was pretty much equivalent to the Great Depression in 1929. And so they were like, well, what worked in 2008? It was stimulus. So we're just going to then, do stimulus again. And your country did it, my country did it. All of a sudden, there were checks going out, checks to organizations, checks to individuals to go and spend, keep the economy moving. Now, the one downside is you can only sort of fire that bullet so many times. And if you do stimulus too many times, there's a natural result, which is inflation. The world has been at a zero interest rates reality. So if you want to borrow, you've been able to borrow huge amounts of money. And whether that's the person who wants to go on a vacation and just put it on their credit card, or the big company like a tech company like Uber, who can just borrow money and operate in debt to keep the business going, it almost was sort of like everyone had a sort of like credit card with an unlimited spend on it. And so it created a bit of a false reality. It kept the economy going, but instead of the economy being really productive, we just had this credit card that we could keep spending. And I remember when inflation started to come back, because inflation has appeared at different times in history, and can be hugely damaging to economies. When inflation began to reappear, I remember there's a quote. This is when it was formerly the X, which was formerly Twitter. And Jack Dorsey put this tweet up, and I think the tweet said this: inflation's coming back and it's going to change everything. I think that was one of the most prescient tweets of the last sort of 10 years.
No kidding.
Because all of a sudden, if you want to borrow a house, it costs more. If you want to go on that vacation, your credit card bill costs more. The true cost of everything all of a sudden started to be revealed. So we've been living in a world where cost was almost irrelevant. You could kick the can down the road with debt. And, the fact that Western economies were not really producing and not really growing, there was this crisis underneath the surface that had been hidden. That crisis is now before us. So when it's just unlimited money, no one cares, you can talk about very sort of like, these idealistic things. So, all of a sudden the person who, is, maybe thinking in a really idealistic terms about how do we make the world a better place, all of a sudden they're looking at bills coming in, their phone bill, their gas bill, their power bill, and they're just going, I can't afford this. And then they start to look to political solutions which can deal with those material realities. So in some ways, we're returning back to what life was before the sort of last 15, 20 years. But that also, so that changes social life, political life, cultural life.
Yeah. 6 months ago, there was not one significant global leader with good ratings in their nation.
Yes.
Right? Everybody was mad at the current situation because of money, because of the cost of things, right? And then that drives this descent from, idealism, post-World War II. We're going to make the world great. Everybody's going to buy into democracy. We're going to have free trade. Everything's just going to keep going up, better and better. And then it doesn't. People start getting mad, a lot of discontent, the tribalism, the fragmentation, right? We're in this gray zone now. Everyone has been feeling the instability. The rising anxiety rates, my background, Mark, has been as a therapist for many, many years. I'm very concerned at the global mental health index. I mean, it's not good. All the data is in the wrong direction. People are not doing well. And in men, all of the mental health indices in men.
They're terrible.
Yeah, they're terrible. There are reasons for the instability. So what we want to say is the instability that you have been intuiting, maybe just at the level of anxiety, is real.
Yes.
It's real. And there are reasons behind it. And we have found it helpful to say things like, hey, everybody, we're in a gray zone. We're moving from one very stable world order into a period that is frankly filled with a great deal of ambiguity and chaos. We just want to name it for you because that's helpful to do so.
Yes.
And then again, I'm going to throw the hope out there towards the the direction we're going is, and God is moving. God is moving. But I don't want to rush to the cookies here. We need to we need to help people understand the nature of the world that you're living in is extraordinarily unstable. You've been intuiting that. Here's why. That's where we are. Or just orienting my listeners.
Well, yeah, and it helps you. It's the same thing of when you go out for coffee with a friend and you can't figure out why things seem off between you. And then in the last 10 minutes of the conversation, they say, oh, by the way, my wife just said, I think we should get a separation. You're like, why didn't you tell me at the beginning
Brilliant.
that something big was going on?
Yes.
I would have felt so sane and like I could just kind of stably
thank you,
relate with what you're going through.
Yeah.
This is on a global level, which it helps you to feel sane when you say, hey, my friend who works at a university is actually more loudly into expressive individualism than I've ever heard. He's like more woke than ever. But at the same time, I'm seeing all of these things like those ideas are going into decline and I just feel tired. And you can say, oh, well, we can kind of say some of the forces that are creating that and you'll feel sane. Yes. Then the big story is that God is at work. He's the he's the sovereign over all history and he's doing things.
Yes. During the pandemic, during the high levels of the lockdowns, I was in a great deal of prayer and prayer and intercession for the world. And here's what I heard, and my listeners have heard me say this before, but I heard the Father say, I am shaking things. And I'm like, Papa, that's rough. Why? And he says, because they will not face their idolatry.
Yes.
And the idolatry of, security in your unlimited credit card, the idolatry, frankly, of idealism, the idolatry of globalism, that, the false securities outside the kingdom of God. So I'm going to pause on that and say, Okay, 3 categories: collaborative to competitive, declining state capacity, democratic health index. Like, just grab
Yeah.
one or riff on
Yeah,
3 or...
Yeah. I'll try and do all of them. So one of the big shifts is moving from a collaborative world to a competitive world, but also seeing that filter down into everything, really. Very much, again, part of that post-world order, there was a lot of global institutions created. Obviously, partly what led to some of the chaos of the first part of the 20th century was the League of Nations not functioning as it was. So that was the body which was like the precursor to the United Nations. But you saw the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and even sporting bodies like, the FIFA, the World Soccer Federation, or, the International Basketball Federation,
Yeah.
where you
Yep.
could have, or the Olympics, you could have North Korea competing against, another country that it would be at war in a sports, arena, which was, quite an incredible thing when you look at the rest of history. And so it was this idea of, if we all work together, and this was the vision of globalization, if we're connected by trade, by the internet, we're connected culturally, that will make us less likely to go to war. So a lot of the reason people have to understand now that these international bodies were created was because people were so scarred by World War II. They just did not want to see that happen again. So how do we stop that? And then you add on that, if it was another world war, you have nuclear weapons. So it's not just millions of people dying, it's literally the world kaput, gone. The potential was, in the 1950s, sort of really grasped with the atomic and a bomb. You see these collaborative things, and that's very much been, filters down. So one thing I often say is, our culture is shaped by global orders. We don't think it in that way. We think, it's just our culture shaping everything. But our culture, Hollywood shapes everything. Now, actually, Hollywood movies always reflect the global order. Is it Rambo 3? Rambo is helping the end of Rambo 3, where he goes to Afghanistan and helps the Mujahideen fight against, the Russians and the Soviet Union. It's like, and I think the end is like, dedicated to the brave Mujahideen. That's because at that time, the US was supporting the Mujahideen to fight against the Soviets. But literally, when you watch that now, you're like, hang on, those guys were probably Al Qaeda. The dads went into Al Qaeda or something. So, culture is shaped by global orders. So that filters down into the boardroom, into the church, into relationships, into business. But what we're seeing now is a return to a competitive world. So a lot of the talk about shift from globalism to nationalism is less just an idea. It's more a reality of a competitive world returning, and also a multipolar world. So again, to use these terms, a unipolar world is where America is dominant and really it's setting all the rules of the game. A multipolar world is where multiple blocks are doing that. So we're not going back to what it was like in the Cold War of the communist world versus the sort of liberal democratic world. There's all these blocks now: Turkey, China, Russia, and there are some axes in there. So you have this idea that increasingly we're in a competitive world. And what that means as well is, let's just bring that down to the very granular people level. I noticed when my kids were young, I don't know if you guys do pass the parcel game at children's birthdays, where you pass the parcel.
No.
Okay, well, you're about to hear some
and then try
Australian
to
culture.
unwrap it. No, I think I know this one.
Yeah.
All right.
So it's a multi-wrapped present, and you pass it around, and when the music stops, someone can unwrap a layer, and then your music goes back on. You pass it around. If you're holding it when the music stops, you unwrap a layer, and it would go around until the final layer, and wherever it landed, the kid who had the last layer of wrapping paper removed, they would get the toy inside. So that was what I grew up with. Hey, you're going to lose some, you're going to win some. But then when my kids were young, I went to start going to some parties, and then I'm like, hang on, every layer has a toy in it now, and every kid gets a toy. And so it's this collaborative world. Everyone gets a prize. And this is the world that they brew. Everyone's going to be included. We want to create a safe space for you. Everyone wants to rise at this time. This has been the cultural, social dynamic, inclusion, diversity, etc. And there's some good things about it. I'm not completely slamming that. But that world now is going back into a highly competitive world, a material world where there's going to be winners and losers. Not everyone's going to be equal. There's going to be consequences which play out. So that changes the world. So you're going to see a lot more competition, but there's a line where competition also becomes conflict. And this is one of the dangerous realities of this. So you see a greater tension, amongst people. You see greater conflict in politics. We need to go back to the fact that, during the 90s, there was literally articles being written that politics is over, that they're just going to be managers now of, and no one cares about politics. No one's excited about it. It's boring. And it was boring back then, where now politics is everywhere. So there's this reality that the world is turning to this much more competitive reality. And then all of a sudden what that means is, so I'm going to give the example of Australia. Australia has been a very successful country. Australia has been a very wealthy country and with a high standard of living, one of the highest in the world. All of a sudden what we realize in this election is, this is my sense, both candidates almost can't do anything because all of the action is elsewhere now. So the action is what Donald Trump does has more impact than the two potential prime ministers in my country. What China does, China just did a sortie of its some naval ships, some of its top ships. They went in the sea between Australia and New Zealand and they started a live fire exercise. So there's a Virgin pilot who's flying over and he sees this live firing exercise and is like, we can't fly over that. The Australian and New Zealand intelligence didn't know about this. So something like 46 flights had to be stopped between Australia and New Zealand. It's extremely busy, Aussies and New Zealanders are going backwards and forwards. And so all of a sudden, we're saying to our government, what can you do about this? And they're like, we're smaller than China. What can we do here? So there's this sense where people stop believing in the democratic process and democracy begins to be almost undermined because what they're seeing is the ability of states to deliver things actually is reduced. So part of what happened was in that period where it was a low interest rates world, where it was a non-competitive world, a unipolar world, is people stopped investing in things that would make the productivity go forward. So in the Cold War, there was a competition with the Soviet Union in technology, in industry, and so that drove things, that drove state capacity. Once the Berlin Wall fell, that sort of stopped around the world, and we went from making stuff to having services. We pushed the making of stuff to other countries. So all of a sudden now, you go around the US and there's these bridges where it's, they probably should be replaced, but the nation doesn't have the ability to do that because it's massively in debt. So that creates this crisis of belief. So just one big idea I'll add here, which might tie all these together, is people have belief in religion. And Peter Berger talked about the fact that people stay in their religious beliefs when that religious belief is making a tangible difference to their everyday life. And often they doubt their beliefs when that doesn't happen. In the same way, if you see the world that we've been living in, of liberal democracy, when that is making a tangible difference in your everyday life, your belief is rock solid. But all of a sudden, when you have these shocks of doubt and it's not making a tangible difference, you start to go through a crisis of doubt. So what we're seeing now is people going through a kind of crisis of doubt around democracy, and particularly emerging generations, where the social contract previously in 1965 was work hard, love your country, you should be able to afford a house, you'll get married, you'll have a material better life than your parents did. That social contract is gone. So you have a rising Gen Z or Gen Z who are like, hang on, we don't believe this anymore. And we don't think democracy is delivering this. Plus, you have a competitor of China whose cities now look like they're 25 years ahead technologically than US cities, and they don't have democracy. And a lot of people online and TikTok are seeing videos about that and asking that question why.
Okay, so interesting that you bring up Gen Z, because at the same time, we are seeing something of a spiritual awakening going on in Gen Z.
And millennials. Woo!
and millennial,
go.
and what was the post 55?
Yeah, in Australia.
Yeah. So okay, so I want to shift now. So let me recap where we've been. If you've been feeling like the world is an unstable place, you're not crazy. If you've been feeling like it's a more competitive place, more antagonistic place, a less idealistic place, you're not crazy. Like, yeah, no, that's all going on. And if it, we are in a time of enormous transition in the world. Enormous transition. We're not going back to 1965 America and then what that meant for the world. We're not. We're not. It's impossible. No clock ever resets. You just God never does that. We're going to pause here because this is going to end up being 2 shows, and I don't want people to get overwhelmed with the amount of content that we have here. So we're gonna pause Mark here for a moment because this is pre-recorded, and the analogy that you use of sitting with a friend at coffee, things are weird.
And then you learn that their life is blowing up. And suddenly you feel like you're not crazy. And you go,
there you go. I was picking up something.
Okay. Yeah, we're okay. But for us, right? It's not meeting a friend for coffee. It's, going to the grocery store and being unable to identify why we feel so off and going through the motions of life. But it feels like something is wrong.
Yeah.
And something is wrong. Yeah. And so you're not crazy, and it can be very stabilizing to hear that.
Yes. And you've got a moment like tariffs and going on, and you go, wow, this all feels really unstable. Or some people might be saying, yeah, stick it to them. Hang on there. You need to have this in a larger context that all sorts of global change is going on right now, all sorts, and has been for a while now. I mean, COVID and what that did to the world. I mean, lots and lots of change. And what we're about to hear in part 2 is, and God is using that because that is opening people up to the gospel. So when we come back in, we're going to pick up with some more big ideas and some summary, and then we're going to talk about the beautiful things that God is doing in the world in part 2. So come back next time because it's going to be worth it.
Hey friends, this is Alan. Thanks for being part of this week's podcast. And before you rush off into what's next, we invite you to spend some time reflecting with God on what you've heard and on where He's leading you.